October member of the Melbourne Electric Vehicle Group. Thank you for coming out on those to come and see us here. I'm going to start off with some EV news first, just some news about what's happening within the group and what's happening around in the EV scene at the moment. We had a working bee on a car on those. So this Capri was converted to electric in 2009, and some of the members came along. And this car's at my house. On those, it's my car, and we had to take the battery pack out of it. On those, the car was converted in 2009, and the battery has failed in it. On those, after years of use, and we're going to replace it with a new battery pack. So the battery in this car is underneath the rear seat. So we had to take the rear seat out on those, and the front seats we took out as well, and then started removing the battery pack. So that was cool. That was a working bee that happened at my place. You can just see through here in the corner of the picture, this is the old Thunder Sky batteries that we've taken out on those, and we're going to replace that with a battery using Panasonic 18650 cells, the same system as is used in the Tesla Roadster. So a well-known system for EVs, and that'll be going into that car. As a front view on those, the electric motor is across the car here like this. On those, it's underneath who you can't see, and this is the motor controller on top here, a Curtis motor controller above the engine. But luckily the conversion's already been done, a lot of the hard work, and we really just need to repair the battery. And so to get the battery replaced commercially would be $8,000–9,000. So it's quite expensive on those, but we have access to the cells, and yeah, it won't cost that much. So it's well underway. Yes. Let's see. The question was, did the batteries last as long as expected on those? So I suppose they didn't. They would have lasted 6 or 7 years on those, because it was converted in 2009. So I would say they only lasted about 5 years. The battery pack in this car was 90 ampere hour, which was really too small for the motor that was used within the car. So they were asking too much of the battery pack. It's got a 9-inch high performance motor within it, a net gain warp, and they draw quite a bit of current. So I think they put too small a battery within the vehicle. Here we go. This is just some specs on the car. On those, it was a Ford Capri, converted in 2008. See the net gain 9-inch DC motor. It originally had 144-volt battery pack. These were Thunder Sky, common batteries that were used at that time, and we're replacing it with the Panasonic 18650 packs that are used in the Tesla cars. On those, it's going to be replaced, and so the capacity will be increased about 70%. On those, a bit more range, and should last longer because it's able to handle that current. And there's a few mechanical and body repairs that I need on the car too. You might notice here, but there's some rust coming down the side here, and there's actually rust in the subframe and through here. That'll have to be commercially repaired. So that's what we did last Saturday on the 10th. On those, people came over at 9 o'clock, and we had a bit of a lunch together as well. Coming up in November, this month, on the 22nd, there's the Festival of Cars, which is run at Cruden Farm at Langwarrin. The Festival of Cars has been organised by the Mental Health Foundation, and it's sponsored by RACV, which RACV are very good. They sponsor a lot of different events around Melbourne. Our electric vehicle expo in March, was sponsored by the RACV. And so we have a spot there at this Festival of Cars. On those, we'll be down there. We're taking several cars down. So I'm looking for some more electric cars to come down, if people would like to come and be involved on those, or to come and sit on the table on those for a while and chat to a few people. We'll have some magazines like Renew and Sanctuary there for sale. We'll have, a table set up for the ATA on those, and so any volunteers who'd like to come down and help on the day and those and sit on the table and chat to people would be really appreciated. So that's the Festival of Cars on the 22nd of November from 11 o'clock. And that's all the news and that I have for today. So today's guest speaker we have is talking about the charging of electric vehicles and how it interacts with the grid, and those, and future planning that's going to be future planning with charging of EVs. So that's Julian de Hoog is coming in on those and chatting to us, so I'll pass over to Julian.
Okay, great. Mic's working good? Everything okay? Yep. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk. I've been to the EV Expo a couple of times and I always love it. I subscribe to Renew, and I love the work the ATA does, and I've worked a little bit with some of the guys working on Simulator and those sorts of things, because I'm working on energy storage now. So when I got the invitation, I thought, this is great, fantastic opportunity, and I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about some work we did. So I'm actually with IBM Research now since the start of this year. But that's only since January. Before that, I spent 3 years at the University of Melbourne as a postdoc, as a research fellow. And we had a 3-year project looking at electric vehicles and what kind of impacts they have on the distribution network. So I'm going to talk entirely about the University of Melbourne work today. This is our group. This was our research group at the University of Melbourne. We had 4 profs, including Evan Mariels, who's the Dean of Engineering, myself as a postdoc, and 4 PhD students. And we were looking at a range of things, but in particular, the impacts of electric vehicles, smart charging, in other words, shifting that load, electric vehicle load to overnight. 1 PhD student working on battery modeling and control, and then we also did some work on microgrid control. And so I don't know if you remember a company called Better Place. Okay, well, they actually, this was a so-called linkage grant project, and they were the industry partner. And it started in, or I guess the project first was discussed in late 2010, I believe, before I even moved here. Then it was confirmed in 2011, and it started in 2012. And things were going good for Better Place at the time. And then halfway through our project, Better Place, for various reasons, ceased to exist. But their whole model had been swappable batteries, so that people buy the car without the battery, and then they basically rent the battery in the same way you use gas for your barbecues. You swap batteries in and out and pay a sort of a subscription fee. And it actually made a lot of sense to me at the time, because it solved the range problem and it solved the expense, sort of really expensive, battery problem. But I think they expanded too quickly, or maybe they were too early, and for various reasons it didn't work out. But we still had the research project, thank goodness. And the question that they were interested in at that point was, if a lot of people start to buy electric vehicles, what will that mean for the networks? Will we see transformers blowing up, or massive impacts that the network operators will fight against and not be happy about? So the first goal of this project was to study that in detail and to really understand what happens in the network in terms of voltages and currents, impact on transformers, voltage at the end of the line, and so on. And the second was, once we had a really good sense of those impacts, what can you do about it? How can you find ways to charge as many vehicles as possible without causing any problems? Yeah, so those were the main goals. So I'll just spend 5 slides quickly talking about our this simulation environment that we designed to do this work and to do the testing. And by the way, please interrupt me at any time if you have any questions. But the first thing we needed was a few good models to work on and to use for our experiments. So we actually worked with some of the distributors, with United Energy and with SP Osnet, and developed 2 suburban networks, and then 1 actually with Ergon in Queensland, a sort of a semi-rural network. And for these networks, we knew where the houses are, which phase they're on, what kind of cables they were using to run down the street and to the houses, what the size of the transformer was, and what the distance was to the furthest house. So we had fairly realistic models. Simulate the existing electricity demand. We again got the most realistic data we could, and this was measured at the transformer. So again, working with the network operators, we got demand profiles specifically for those networks at different times of the year, and weekdays versus weekends, all of which can make a difference. To simulate electric vehicles arriving and departing, and to understand what the charging needs would be, in other words, how far they had driven, we didn't really have electric vehicle data, and some of the other trials in other parts of the world were only just starting. So the best we could do was take normal vehicle data, and fortunately the Victoria State government does these fairly detailed surveys every 4 years or 5 years, and the most recent one at that time was the 2009 survey. So this gave us records of how people travel, and when we took only the vehicle records, so people's personal transportation, we had 13,000 records of how people travel across 24 hours. So that gave us a very good idea of how far people travel, when they arrive at home, when they leave home in the morning, and so on. And this was also tagged by suburb, so we could even then use the ones that were specific to the networks that we had models for. Oops. Then to make sure that we were modeling the electrical networks properly, we built them up in a package called MATLAB SimPower Systems, which does all the load flows and tells you what your voltages and currents everywhere are. And finally, to make sure we had pretty realistic simulations and realistic models, we did a few tests where we took the existing load profiles, we fed them in, and then we just compared the measurements in our model to what was actually measured in the real world. And it was very, very close. So voltages were within 0.6% and currents within 7%. This is a standard way to do research. You build all your models and you make sure that they're reasonably close to reality. So they weren't perfect, but they were pretty close. So I'll go through a few of the key results from some of the early tests. So when you think about what impact electric vehicles will have on the grid, the first thing everybody thinks about probably is peak demand and electric vehicle demand coinciding with existing peak demand, and that's exactly what we found. So it's a very expected and intuitive result, but with our models we confirmed it, that basically the light blue is kind of how people use electricity throughout the day, and you get a peak sort of around 7, 8 p.m. when people use the most. And then as you'd expect, everybody arrives at home at 6 p.m., 7 p.m., and if people just plug in their car right away, then you get these massive increases in your peak demand. And the obvious disadvantage or drawback of that is that this huge amount of demand puts a lot of stress on the transformers and the lines. That was an obvious one. A little bit less obvious was the impact on voltage. So when you plug in an electric car or an air conditioner or anything for that matter, you're drawing more current through the lines. Those lines themselves have an impedance, and so the voltage will actually go down from one house to the next going down the street. So if you measure your voltage at home, if you're all, given that this is an EV group, you've probably all got whatever multimeters and things you need to do that. It's supposed to be 230 plus 10% minus 6%, I believe. But it could be 235 at your house, it could be 230, it could be 225. And so the more current you're drawing through, the more, that there's more current is facing that impedance in the lines, and the more the voltage drops. And that means when you plug in your electric vehicle, your voltage drops, but so do the voltages of the houses around you. And actually, we found that voltage issues, so the lowest voltage at the house at the end of the line, was a problem before too much peak demand. So it was actually more of an issue than too much current overload. And when we did the lit review and we looked at what was happening elsewhere in the world, that was similar to findings they had in Portugal and Ireland and Germany and some other places as well. So voltage is it's one of those things that if your voltage is too low in your house, you won't necessarily notice it, or you won't know. But the impact is that if you have constant power loads and the voltage drops too low, they need to draw more current to run at the same power. So more current means that they heat up and they age faster and so on. And often the network operators don't even know necessarily that voltage isn't within limits at certain houses. So unless people call up and complain because they've measured it or because they noticed it somehow, this does happen, and it's probably happening in several places. And then one more important and underappreciated impact is phase unbalance. So most houses in Australia are connected single phase. And do people understand single phase versus three phase generally? I'm assuming it's a fairly technical group, yeah. So, so ideally in distribution networks, you want the houses balanced quite evenly across the phases. So houses, same number of houses on phase A as on phase B as on phase C. And if they're perfectly balanced, then you have no current going through the neutral. But as soon as your networks get unbalanced and you have extra too many houses on one phase versus another, then because of that unbalance, you end up getting more current through the neutral line. And that means you also have more voltage drop and more, then it's just inefficient generally. So most of our networks are quite unbalanced, partly again, because network operators have never had the incentives to run their networks as efficiently as possible. So they didn't need to care. And so as soon as people were connected, whether they were on A, B, or C, nobody really cared, and they don't even keep track of it. So some of the models I'll show later, you can see that they're really, really unbalanced.
What sort of level of unbalance would you regard as that's a well-balanced?
No network will ever be properly balanced, because even if you get the houses 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you know how people use energy.
There we see it's a big unbalanced running about 4%, which doesn't sound enormously problematic to one who's not knowledgeable in the field.
Yeah, well, so if I remember, the distribution code requires phase balance to be, so these red lines and all these figures are the required limits. It's been a while, so I can't 100% remember. I think for single phase customers, they aren't required to have this balancing, but if they have three-phase customers and they supply very unbalanced electricity, then that causes problems. And so for three-phase customers, I believe the unbalance has to be below 2%. And so we saw it go a lot, much higher than that in many of these networks. So then another interesting result that came out of some of these early tests was, so this is a real network. I can't tell you exactly where it is, but it's pretty close to here. And so the triangles are houses on phase A, the circles are houses on phase B, and the squares on phase C. And you can see right away it's not very well balanced. You have 50 houses on phase A, 21 on phase C. And that could be something as simple as when the lines run along the street and the engineer comes to connect a house, one of them just happens to be closer. So I've been told that could be one of the reasons that they're so unbalanced. But in this situation, if you give every house the exact same load, which one do you think has the lowest voltage? Guess is welcome, but basically it's going to be the house on the most highly loaded phase that is as far away from the transformer, that is the farthest from the transformer. So this house will be the one that's the first to have low voltage problems. So then we thought, okay, well, let's add an electric vehicle there and let's see what happens to the voltage. And then we measured it, I forget what it was, 220 maybe. And then we said, okay, we'll take that vehicle away from that house and we'll start adding vehicles at the best places in the network. And we'll see how many we can add at the best places before we get the same minimum voltage as one at the worst place. And we added vehicles and we added vehicles and we added and we added and we added. Somewhat from the inside out, we kept adding vehicles. And finally, after we added 45 vehicles at other locations in the network, did the voltage at this house drop as low as having only one vehicle here. So we thought, that can't be right, 45 versus 1. But it does actually make sense, because if you look where we've added vehicles, they're all on the squares. So we're adding vehicles on phase C. Phase C is the one that's the most lightly loaded, has the fewest houses on it. And so the more loads you add on that phase, the more you bring your phases back into balance, and the less current you have in the neutral, and the more capacity you have in the network to add vehicles, or the more, it basically rebalances the network. So so what that could mean is you could have people living next door to each other, and one of them plugs in and drags down the voltage like crazy for himself and for all of his neighbors, and the other one plugs his vehicle in and brings the voltage, or improves the network and makes it easier for others to plug their vehicles in. So it's not a this is not a very, very serious problem, and it's very easily fixed. All you need to do is get the network operator to send an engineer in and reconnect a few houses, which is a very simple thing to do. But it kind of hit home that at distribution level, which isn't actually that well studied, and people haven't really cared about it much, these very strange effects can happen, and so it's something to keep in mind. So another thing, when we started looking at the typical travel profiles, this is one way to visualize it. So every horizontal line represents one person's travel over 24 hours. White areas indicate that they're away from home. Green and orange means that they're at home. And when you look at how far they've traveled, the orange represents how long it would take them to recharge if it was a Nissan Leaf, for example. So that, for example, this person here left home, or let's take, I don't know, let's take this person here. They left home at 10 in the morning. They were gone until 3 p.m. They got home. They hadn't driven very far. They had a short recharge time, and then they were home. And this is something, again, a fairly intuitive result, nothing revolutionary here. But if you visualize it this way, first of all, you can see that a lot of them kind of have this coincident charging because they all get home at the same time. But more importantly, there's this huge amount of flexibility overnight. So for the vast majority of people, whether they've charged in those 2 hours after they get home, or if they charge here or here or here or here, it just doesn't matter. So we have all this flexibility to shift charging for all these vehicles in a way that is convenient. And so this is load control or demand response, or whatever you want to call it. Applies to electric vehicles, but also to all kinds of other things in the network. But can we actually do this centrally? So within the academic community, there are a lot of people who talk about if you could control this centrally, then you could find the best possible way to do it. And that's what I was working on. But other people talk about distributed ways. So trying to decide at each electric vehicle when to charge in a way that is good for the network. So I'm going to talk a bit about both types, centralized versus distributed. But so one question around central methods, and there are a lot of academics who find great solutions, but can you actually implement them in the real world? Could you centrally control all these electric vehicles charging? So this was one thing I think Christian Hanberg, who used to run the VIC EV trial, talked about here to this group a year and a half ago. There was a part of the Victoria electric vehicle trial was to demonstrate exactly that. So United Energy teamed up with DS Computing, who were building some of these charge points, and the Department of Transport, and showed that it is possible. So in, I think, only 7 participants were actually involved, but in these 7 houses, United Energy sent a signal to the smart meter. The smart meter communicated to the charge point over Zigbee, and then the charge point interrupted or reduced the charging of the electric vehicle. It was just to show that it's possible. It took them a few months to make it work, but it works. So here in Victoria, where we have smart meters everywhere, it works. But if you think about other places, India, parts of Canada, the US, where maybe only 10% of houses have smart metering, more difficult. But assuming you can control things centrally, should I just give it to you and keep going? Or? Okay, great. There's no lights, but I don't know if that. Okay. Yep, sound is okay? Great. Okay. Okay, so here I get into how we solve this problem, and I might go through it somewhat quickly because I get some fun equations, which are maybe too much. But basically, you can take, so if you have your electricity network and you know what it looks like and you know how many vehicles are there, you're trying to find the best way to charge these vehicles over your horizon, so over the next 6 hours or 10 hours or whatever you choose. You can express that as a single problem that you solve as a single optimization problem. And so we use receding horizon optimization, also called model predictive control, where basically what you do is you say, right now, given everything I know, what is the best way to choose the charge rates over the next 6 hours? Okay, I've solved it. I'll apply the rates to all these vehicles right now. Done. You wait 5 minutes. Things might have changed. Some people may have left. Other vehicles may have arrived. And you say, okay, change conditions. Let's calculate it for the next 6 hours. And so you have this kind of rolling window of problem solving that you're doing, and every time you're applying the first solution, the first instance. So going into all that, when you do that, you can arguably find the best possible way to distribute available power to the vehicles in such a way that you don't cause any network problems. And so we solved it, and we wrote a paper on it. And in the same, so these were the figures I showed you earlier. Exactly the same houses, same vehicles. In this case, we were showing it for 50% EV uptake. So every second house owns an EV. That's not going to happen for some time, except maybe in some neighborhoods. But if that were to happen, you'd have this huge peak if you don't control it. And if you do control it, you can prevent that peak, and using the solution, you can shift this excessive load and move it over here and move it into the overnight period. And you can, because you're solving the whole problem and you're taking all these constraints into account, you can also make sure that voltage at every house stays within those required limits. The trade-off being, though, if you are charging, so this is where you don't control charging. This example car is charged by 9 p.m. If you do control it a bit, this car would have, it would start charging at 5. It would have to wait a bit, then it could charge for an hour, then it has to wait for an hour, then it charges for an hour, then it waits for a bit, and then it charges. So it ends up being charged by 11:30. So that's the trade-off. It takes 2 hours, maybe 3 hours longer for each vehicle to charge, but you can put lots of vehicles in the network. You can get them all charged, certainly by the time people typically need them at 6 a.m. And you don't cause any problems in the network. So we also played around with it. Once you've got this problem formulation set up, you can look at other advantages. So another way we looked at it was from the perspective of somebody like Better Place, an aggregator, somebody who would be responsible for charging lots of electric vehicles, or maybe a retailer or something. And in their case, they want to make sure people have charged vehicles, but they also want to charge them when the price is low. So if this is a typical fluctuations in the wholesale electricity price, and you can use the same solution to shift that EV load into the time when the price is the lowest. So you can, if you're buying electricity on the wholesale market to charge vehicles that you're in charge of, you can save a lot of money as well. And so every network is different, and some networks might have voltage problems, others might have a small transformer that gets stressed. So it's hard to make kind of blanket conclusions that apply to everything. But we looked at all these networks. We looked at different times a year, weekdays versus weekends. And a broad conclusion is that if you don't control charging, then at around 10 to 15% penetration, you start to see problems. So once every 10th person in the network buys an electric vehicle, that's when you are likely to start seeing problems. And the first problem we saw in these networks was the low voltage issue. On the other hand, if you do control it, in the way that we solved it, and people are willing to let their vehicle be charged when somebody else thinks it's best, which is an iffy question, but if people are willing to give up that charging, then our networks here in Melbourne and in Victoria could take a huge amount of EV penetration without any upgrades. So you don't need any new transformers, you don't need new lines. We've got so much space in the networks overnight that almost everybody could have an electric vehicle without any major investment required. And this is a very crude analysis of what that means. So for every network of about 100 people, if you need to install a new transformer because people are buying electric vehicles, it costs $100,000 to $150,000. So just by controlling when people charge, you can save $1,000 to $2,000 per household. So it's significant. And finally, a last conclusion is related to an aggregator. If an aggregator were to control when vehicles charge, they could have savings of 10 to 20% in the cost of the energy that they buy to charge them. So that kind of concludes a lot of the work that I did in this research project, centralized charging. But I want to just take a few slides and talk about what one of our PhD students did, which was distributed electric vehicle charging. So the idea behind distributed charging is nobody can centrally control your vehicle, but you put in a plug or a charge point or software in your vehicle that on its own decides when is a good time to charge the vehicle. And this was somewhat inspired by a product that IBM developed in India, where they have a lot of problems with power, electrical networks going down. And the idea is that when a lot of people are using electricity, your voltage tends to go down for the reasons I was talking about earlier. And when they aren't, your voltage is higher. So just by looking at how the voltage goes up and down over the last few days, you can kind of predict when there's space in the network to add new loads to the network. And we thought if they can do this for washing machines and dishwashers, we can do it for electric vehicles. So I'll skip this one. So he ran a lot of the same experiments I did, and these were the results for centrally controlling electric vehicle charging. And if you don't use central control, use only distributed control, these are the results. So again, you just by making the decision at each vehicle instead of for the network as a whole, you can still make sure that you don't let that peak load go too high. Your voltage stays very nice and stable where you want it. But a bit of a trade-off is you don't get quite as much, it wasn't quite as good at getting as much current to the vehicles as possible. So there is a bit of a risk using that method that your vehicle doesn't get charged in time, or only to 85 or 90%. But just an opinion, a personal opinion, I feel generally for demand response, these distributed methods have a lot of promise. And that means you don't need to have all the infrastructure and all the smart meters and all that kind of stuff. But another question that is still to be answered is, how do you get people to do it? How do you convince people it has to be worth it for them? And that's this is basically my last slide. So just one more quirky result. We did think about this a bit. How do you get people to do it? What if you had different user plans? So some people are willing to pay a bit more to make sure their vehicles charge quickly, and others don't care too much. If it's charged by midnight or 5 a.m., they don't care, so they'll pay a little bit less. Or for example, if you're on the budget plan, but you know you need your vehicle fully charged 2 hours because you have an important trip, then you just pay a little bit more. How can you get people's preferences involved? And so we thought, well, we'll do this very simple extension to our work where people can choose level A, level B, level C, and we'll just show what it means. But we had so many strange things happening where we couldn't get our solution to solve in the way that we expected. And so I'll just explain why. So this is just a toy example, but if we give every single house in this network, and again, this is a real network, and it's based on real individual phase connections and so on. If we give everyone the exact same load, fairly high load, then the voltages, I guess, so if we focus just on these 3 houses for this example, the voltage at houses 28, 29, and 30 will be 228, 238, and 217. So you see big differences in the voltage at each house. And again, this comes back to unbalance. So now if we add a vehicle only at this house, then the voltages change slightly at 28 and 29. But where we've added the EV, it drops down 2 volts. So you're now below that minimum 216 threshold. So that's a problem. So let's say we take that vehicle away and we add it only at 28. Then the voltage at 28 drops down a little bit. But the voltage at house 30 pops up a little bit because you're rebalancing the network by adding that vehicle. And so now if you leave the vehicle at house 28 and now you add a vehicle back to house 30, you're okay. So the point is, the guy at this house can only charge his vehicle if the guy at this house is plugging in his vehicle to stay within voltage limits. And so if you're trying to express this in terms of people's preferences, and this guy is willing to pay $100,000 to get a full level of charge, and this guy doesn't care, well, still, you have to put this guy, connect him first before you can connect him, just to make sure that the voltages and everything stay within limits. So anyway, it's a very unexpected result, and it's something for the network operators to think about. And rebalancing will solve a lot of these problems, but some funny things can happen. And some of these things are sort of happening with solar PV in the opposite way. So a lot of people are seeing strange voltage rises because people are generating. That's it. And this was me and my 1-year-old son at the EV Expo earlier this year, and he isn't convinced yet, but I'll work on it. So thank you very much. Yep.
Excuse me.
Hello, testing. Yeah. Why did you assume at the beginning that everyone's going to plug their cars in and start charging as soon as they get home, rather than wait till off-peak time?
Well, that's a good point. So one of the things that came out of the Vic EV trial is that a lot of people, especially I think Nissan Leaf owners, where you could choose the schedule, start charging them at 11 p.m. So you can put a timer in, but it doesn't. So I'm not sure it would make much of a difference, because either you have people coming home 4, 5, 6, 7 p.m. and then they start charging 4, 5, 6, or they all start charging at 11 p.m. So you'd still get a new peak at 11 p.m.
The basic level is much lower at 11 p.m.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, so it's a good point, but we would have that here where we've got peak and off peak, but even then, not everyone has peak and off peak rates. Yeah, so some people don't.
Look at your power bill. You look at your power bill. Well, I think it's always 11 o'clock, isn't it?
It depends on the time of the year.
Does it?
Always 11 o'clock, yeah.
I'll take my ride and see what's going on with me. Okay, anyway.
So that would have been, you're right, it would have been good to understand what percentage would be on off peak and what percentage wouldn't care. But it was to look at the worst case uncontrolled, and it was somewhat also to keep the study in line with international studies elsewhere, which did the same thing.
What's going to happen in the future?
Well, I hope more people will buy electric vehicles, and I hope that negative impacts on the networks won't cause anyone to try to keep people from buying electric vehicles. So I hope that the results from this work will convince people that we do have a lot of capacity, and it's not a problem. It's not going to bring the grid down. It won't cause new requirements for new investment in the grid, and that part of it is not an issue. So I hope so.
Yes, I suppose, Tone, with the work that's been done, with this research that's been done, they can look forward as they see vehicles start to come onto the grid. They then have an idea of how we're going to cope with this, and what are some of the models that'll work on those to overcome any problems that develop.
Yeah, and some of the more forward-looking ideas are, of course, that EVs will start to be used as tools to run the grid better. So rebalancing is one example, but you could also use them for load balancing, frequency regulation, all voltage stability, all kinds of other things. And some of the vehicle to grid, I think everyone agrees that this would be a great idea, and the only problem is how do you, there are so many people involved in making that happen, how do you find a way to do it that everyone can benefit? So right now, vehicle manufacturers put warranties on these batteries, but if suddenly people start to use them for storage as well, and then they get cycled twice a day instead of once, then the aging is twice as fast, and suddenly the manufacturers have to deal with all these vehicles coming back. So it's a bit of a challenge trying to make sure everybody wins.
That's true, and the battery storage to grid on those will be with solar. Of course, we're now starting to see battery backup systems, and that to be able to use with solar, and that's going to be a huge growth area, and that in the future, as the battery costs come down, and these battery storage systems or home battery storage system, where a good way to put it, will start to become available, especially for people who have solar installations as well on their house. A question over here.
Yeah, I just wondered whether
Could you?
In your modelling, Julian, did you assume that the car was going to be fully charged every time it was plugged in?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, is that in fact reasonable? Because I don't fill up my car every time I drive past a fuel station in a petrol car, because I've got some reserve capacity, and that's and if I know I'm going to have a peak load coming up, like a long trip coming up, well, obviously I make sure that I'm covered for that. Now, I wonder if we can think something like that for recharging, that maybe, or so that not every one of the customers has to fully recharge their car overnight, for example. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I certainly, when you look at how people use their vehicles in some of the early studies and trials, some of the big ones in the US, because people do worry about range, they do want to make sure the battery's full in the morning. So people have been doing that. I think as the capacities get larger, people won't feel as much of a need to charge them every night. And I believe that, especially with many of the chemistries, it's actually better for the life of the battery also to not keep it at 100%. And your battery will last longer if you keep it around 50, 60, 70 rather than charging it to the top. But yeah, we didn't use that.
Yeah, I wanted to comment that being an electric vehicle owner, I like my Victrix, which has a range of 200 kilometres. On those, I don't fully charge it each night. On those, you know, I would consider what trip do I need to make the following day and how flat is the battery, and then I'll set the time clock for the number of hours on those. So I'll decide, you know, how many hours am I going to charge it tonight? Or even since I have a solar system on the house, I might say, is tomorrow going to be a sunny day? And should I charge it during the day? So there's a number of things that I think about there on that with my vehicle. On those, you know, after I own an electric vehicle for a few years. And because it has sufficient range, you know, a lot of the trips I make are only 20, 30, 40 kilometres on those, so I don't have to charge it fully every night.
Right.
And of course, the life of the battery would be longer for that reason. Questions? Yeah.
Just looking ahead, say 10, 20 years, thousands of these vehicles on the road, long distances. How is it going to affect charging points along the highways, for instance? Yeah, I mean, is that going to be a problem?
Good. You mean a problem in terms of getting them installed, or a problem in terms of the electrical network? Well, I think in general, when you pre-plan locations where you're expecting high levels of charging, then it's very easy to predict what infrastructure you need. It's going to cost money to install transformers and cables that are big enough, but that's very easy to plan for. And especially if they're coming in now, then people will know what's required, which is different from all our residential networks, which were planned 20, 30, 40 years ago, where nobody even thought about EVs. So I don't think that would be a problem. For sure, there's an expense involved, and it's the old chicken and egg. The more EVs there are, the more incentives there are for charging points. The more charging points there are, the more people buy EVs. But what comes first?
Okay, so the next, following that, there's charging points. That if everybody decides to charge right now at the same station, of course, you're going to have a locked system, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way that you can know that there's another charging point, another 50 Ks or somewhere else? Is that going to be available? Obviously, they would have to be available, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure.
And would you know that is there a time, things that you can actually book ahead? I'm going to arrive there at that time and have a charging station ready for me, so I don't have to wait around for another 2 hours for somebody else to come off.
That's a good question.
I was just thinking.
But
I was thinking on that question on those, because that's charging when you're traveling, like highway charging for people who want to be able to fast charge on those because they're doing long trips as such. Most of those fast chargers will be connected to a 3-phase outlet on those, and they charge at 50 kilowatts or higher. Some of them will be available 100 kilowatts or 150 kilowatts. So they would be dedicated chargers, you know, that would be at a particular place for a fast charging as such. So they'll have a 3-phase outlet already. They'll be put in places where they have access, you know, to a main power feed as such. And some of the software is already available in the cars to be able to know where some of these charging points are coming up. Last month we showed the Tesla setup. Like Tesla now have 3 charging stations between Melbourne and Sydney. So they've set up one at Euroa, one at Gundagai, and one at Goulburn. But of course, you can only charge a Tesla car on there because it's a supercharged system, and no one else is allowed to use it. But we'll start to see some of those systems and that being set up on those, and they'll probably put it places where you can stop and have a meal and have a bit of a rest, and while your car is being fast charged, you know, for the next part of your trip.
And it doesn't. It's well, how long would it take for a Tesla to recharge at a fast charger?
About 30 to 40 minutes to go up to
right?
70 or 80% of capacity. So, and that would be another 300, 350 kilometers traveling.
That's right. So it's what you need for a coffee and a toilet break. And I know they have I've seen them in the US. They've got a huge supercharger network all over the US, and it's growing quickly. So it's working over there, and hopefully we'll get it over here too.
If we go upstream from the transformer, I can ask a question about the power generating systems and how this will be affected. I have heard that in Victoria, electric cars are completely pollution free because the brown coal power stations are burning coal overnight anyway, and their power would otherwise go to waste anyway, as long as you're charging at the off-peak period. What sort of penetration of the populace with electric cars would that still apply to before they have to start burning more coal and they are actually producing pollution?
Yeah, so I've heard the interesting argument that EVs are the cleanest if you're charging them at peak time, because that's when gas generators will be firing up rather than coal. Which is an interesting way to think about it, but I don't know. You'd have to look at the energy mix that's there right now and what's happening with demand. I don't know. I'd like to see them being used as part of and I wonder whether economically they'll make the most sense as part of a solar plus storage plus EV kind of solution, where you're generating your own electricity, you're storing it, and then you can charge your car off it. And I'd be, yeah, we're looking now at the economics of storage, and I wonder whether if you factor in the cost of your transport as well, in many cases that'll make the whole package economically better than just going for 2 of the 3. So it's something we're looking at the moment. So I don't have an answer.
It would be an advantage, wasn't it, if that continual load from the coal power stations and that has been able to be used for electric vehicles on those, overnight time. On those, that would be a real advantage, wouldn't it? Both environmentally, but also economically. Maybe with the introduction of smart meters, they'd be able to offer reduced rates. They'd be able to signal, when they want to load shed, and those they want load to come onto the network. On those at not big type time because there's excess capacity there, and then have a very low rate on those that they would charge people just because they're shedding load. Because this happens overseas. On those, it happens in Europe and in America, and that where there's times where the wholesalers can be buying electricity for next to 0 cents on those because the particular network is trying to shed load at that time. As more smart meters penetrate and they decide to start using them for this purpose, the power companies, we may see times during the day, when your power rate could be extremely low.
Great. Is
there anything else? Oh, we've had quite a few questions tonight. Thank you, Annette, for Julian, for coming.
Thanks a lot.
And chatting to us, and we've had a good discussion about the power network, as what you were saying, and then a few more general questions afterwards about charging and how the grid and that would be affected. Yeah. So thank you for coming along tonight.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks a lot.